Welcome back into the Dynasty Nerds YouTube page. I'm Garrett Price, and we have an awesome guest for today. We have Scott Barrett from Fantasy Points. I love his work, especially, a Neanderthal film grinder like myself. I love to look at some of his analytics, some of his numbers, some of the things that he's seeing. So I'm really excited to dig in with him today and see all the stuff that he's been working on. But Scott, how are you doing, man?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me. And
Absolutely,
and
absolutely.
don't call yourself a Neanderthal film grinder. There, especially a few years ago, there's this big heated debate, film versus analytics, and like even being an analytics guy, I'm very pro film, and recognize how important that is. One guy in particular, I was my the production model didn't like Alec Pierce at all, and athleticism model he of course popped, which is obvious. And I kind of want to just push him up my rankings. I really try and stay true to my models, but I loved his tape. Alec Pierce, I just like unreal explosion off the line. He was getting like Jameson Williams type cushions, and he was beating those. And all the underneath stuff he did was, really incredible. He seemed to get that given to him, handed to him every single time. And I just like had no idea why he didn't get more of those, why his numbers weren't as impressive as I thought the tape was. I know a part of that, he was penalized in my model because Desmond Ritter has fringe late round one, early round two draft capital. But when I watched Alec Pierce, I saw just a number of horrifically thrown balls, but he had great separation on those routes. So I'm excited to, I'll talk about what the stats say, what my models say, but I'm eager to hear your opinion from a film analyst perspective.
Yeah, man, I think most people that have come around to like, hey, there's probably good room for both. Both give you some insights that you might not get otherwise. So I think even the most hardcore analytics guy or the most hardcore film guy can probably agree there's some benefits and merits in both.
I'm going to take that as you didn't love Alec Pierce on tape.
I had I wasn't crazy high, I wasn't crazy low. I think I'm pretty consensus on him.
Okay. I had him, I think, yeah, I had him below, of the non-power five guys, I had him below Watson, Sky Moore, Jalen Tolbert. But I liked his tape more than Tolbert's. I think I liked his tape more than Sky Moore's. Who's sort of like both an
Oh,
analytics and film darling, but he's sort of underwhelmed me in both accounts.
yeah, no, Alec Pierce is there's a player in this class, a late round guy that I actually want to ask you about because I think they compare very similarly. So I'm curious as to how you think these two players can compare because I think that they both reminded me a lot of each other. I just think one is going to probably get pretty solid draft capital, and I'm not sure that the other one will. So I'll be interested to talk about that. But I wanted to dig in a little bit into some of the stuff that you did with fantasy points. And, we've seen this kind of a growing trend of these bigger companies, bigger organizations where this top tier talent like yourself kind of decides, you know what, I kind of want to start something on my own. And you guys were one of the first ones to do it. So tell me a little bit about fantasy points and how you guys got to the point where you're like, you know what, we're going to do our own thing.
Yeah, so it all started like 20 years ago. John Hansen was really one of the primary trailblazers within the fantasy football industry. He's been in this game longer than Matthew Berry, pretty much longer than anyone. And he ran a site called Fantasy Guru, and they were hiring a full-time writer. And I applied for that job, and then Graham Barfield beat me out for it. And then Graham went, and then NFL.com was hiring a full-time writer, and I applied for it. And then Graham beat me out for that again. And then Graham and I, Graham worked tirelessly. We've always been good friends, to try and get me over at NFL.com. And that was like apparently like a lock. I was basically told like, oh, you're going to go to NFL.com once the season ends. And then the person in charge of the hiring decision uh, lost his job. And then like his number two got moved to a different department. And the person replacing him got fired within a week. It was something like that. So that never
Oh
materialized.
my gosh.
And so John Hansen ran Fantasy Guru, and then he sold it. And then he just like took a year or two off. And he was like, you know what? I want to do this again. I want to create a super team. And so he got the whole gang back together, all the old Fantasy Guru guys, Joe Dolan, Tom Brawley. And Graham was like, all right, this time I'm going to make it happen. We're going to bring Scott Barrett on board. They made a pitch to me, and it sounded great. So, yeah, I left PFF, and I came over and joined the Fantasy Points super team.
That's awesome, man. That's awesome. Well, you guys put out some incredible work. I love the stuff that you guys are doing.
Yeah, and we also got to bring Wes Huber, who I worked with at PFF full time, and he's done incredible work for us. And we have a really exciting announcement coming in June. So be on the lookout for that.
Ooh, my birthday's in June, so that's good to know.
Nice little birthday present.
All right. Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, let's get into talking about some of these players. And, you mentioned Alec Pierce is one of the guys that didn't match up film wise necessarily with your analytics. But what's one guy that you would say this is much more a film, a guy that on film might not have graded as well, but analytically, just everything looks on point for this player?
Well, you said before the show this is going to be more wide receiver focused. I will say Breece Hall, like that's my RB1. That's sort of everyone's RB1. Kenneth Walker, really strong RB2. Trey McBride, the model, absolutely loved him. I thought the tape was solid, but those seem like very easy calls. And then wide receiver is where it gets tricky. And it's really tricky just this year in general. Like I'll talk to my top 5 go-to film experts, and Greg Cassell says George Pickens is a significantly better player on film than Drake London. Alec Pierce was better on film than Drake London. You talk to Mike Renner, and he's like, no, that's my wide receiver 1. He's awesome. Treylon Burks, I have one of my go-to film experts comped him to Jonnu Smith and would not take him in day 2. And then others, Lance Zierlein said this is A.J. Brown with more wiggle. Danny Kelly says this is a bigger Deebo Samuel. Greg Cassell comped him to both of them. You have Jim Nagy, who I'd had on my podcast, said this is a lesser version of Laviska Shenault. And that's really what we have with this wide receiver class. It's just riddled with red flags, but otherwise a lot to like. And I feel like I shaped the narrative on Drake London when I talked about his percentage of non-screen catches coming on contested catches, and the list of cohorts at the top of that list is just all of the biggest busts of the past 5 years. And you drop that down, you look at the top 30 of that list, and it's all busts or guys whose names you've never heard of, and it's alarming. But otherwise, the production profile was pristine. I don't have an athleticism profile on him. He elected not to run the 40-yard dash. That's a red flag. But by my production model, this is a very, very special prospect. The third best age-adjusted yards per game season since 2000 in 2021. In 2020 and 2019, he was comparably productive to Michael Pittman, who is nearly 4 years older, more productive than Amon-Ra St. Brown, who's 2 years older. And he was still on the basketball team at this time, so he wasn't making football his sole focus. Obviously, the contested catch thing is a big concern. It's a big concern for me, but every wide receiver in this class has a very damning, very scary, very intimidating red flag. And so I have to come up with my rankings now. It's like, where do I put him? No 40, this red flag, but the model likes him. It's tough. Now is where the subjective comes in. But I'll say this. Again, I'm not a tape guy, but I watched Treylon Burks every single target back to back with Drake London every single target, and Treylon first, then Drake, and it felt like watching Geely 2 and Godfather 2 back to back. But again, I'm not a tape guy.
Well, I'm with you on this overall. I even though I'm a tape guy, and it seems like the film grinders for the most part are interested. I actually had Treylon Burks as my wide receiver 7 currently. There's some things that I'm
Wow.
definitely concerned about in his profile. There was just a lot of things as far as his route running goes. Very very incomplete prospect there. I don't think he plays as physical as you would imagine for somebody of his size. So it's just a really, really raw
Yeah.
player that we're looking at. So it's going to be interesting to see how all of this ends up playing out. Is there one receiver in this class, though, for you at this point that you would say is safe?
Yeah. So that's what I did is I, you know, uh, came up with the production model, just spits out the scores, and I ranked them thusly. And then I had a nice little section on red flags, and the least damning was Garrett Wilson. His biggest red flag
Mhm.
was he only ranked fourth. He was practically tied with Chris Olave at wide receiver 2, but it was that was like really his only red flag. You can talk about the low BMI, but I mean that wasn't anywhere near on the level of a Jamison Williams, of a Tyquan
Right.
Thornton, and really this is just like a very skinny class. It was the fastest wide receiver class ever, but by weight adjusted 40, it was like a perfectly average class. It was just also the skinniest class, and maybe the NFL is trending in that direction, but uh, yeah, outside of that, no real red flags. So the question I'm asking myself specifically today, my final rankings come out tomorrow, is the lack of a red flag. Is that enough to push my wide receiver 4 up to wide receiver 1? Be more in line with expected draft capital? I don't know. I'm leaning towards no at the moment, but I mean you could certainly make that case.
Yeah, absolutely. That is currently my wide receiver 1, and that's part of the reason, especially in this class where there are so many question marks at so many different positions. I mean, quarterback, we haven't even touched on quarterback, but there are just question marks galore at that position. So in a class
Mm-hmm.
where there's just so much uncertainty, I think the safety in guys like Brees and guys like Garrett Wilson definitely are very appealing to me. Uh, you mentioned Alec Pierce earlier, and so I want to bring this up. What are your thoughts on Isaiah Weston, small school guy, Northern Iowa? But when we're talking about an athletic score, I mean, we're seeing one of the best athletic scores of all time, third overall, I believe, as far as relative athletic scores go. But an older prospect, smaller school, but on tape, they reminded me a lot of each other. Tall, really explosive, can go up and get the football, good speed, but they're pretty stiff in their route running, almost look like, tight ends almost at times. What are your thoughts on Alec Pierce, but more importantly to me, Isaiah Weston, who's one of my deep dart throws?
Yeah, I love that. He's one of my favorite deep dart throws too. The only concerning thing is I haven't heard anyone talk about him, despite having one of the best combines ever by my custom score. I call it Spork score, which just only looks
Okay.
at the most predictive athletic variables for each position, and it's kind of like broken up into separate archetypes. So there's like the smaller, shiftier slot wide receiver archetype, and there's like the big, fast, DK Metcalf type archetype. And Weston falls into that archetype. It's 6'4", 214 pounds. By my numbers, this was the 27th best combine performance by any wide receiver since 2000 of nearly 1,000
Nice.
qualifiers. Really freak athlete. And like the numbers, my production model didn't love him, but there were certainly some stats where he popped. So since 2014, of again nearly 1,000 qualifiers, he ranks 7th best in career yards per target average, behind only Jalen Waddle, Jamar Chase, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Jamison Williams, Marquise Brown, and Devonta Smith. He ranks best overall by career yards per reception average. Interestingly, Christian Watson ranks top 10 on both lists, but he's a non-FBS guy. I think this, of course, he's super old, but I think this could be this year's Jacob Harris for me. Someone who no one really talked about until very late in the process. But just from the athleticism profile, I'm like, okay, this is a guy I want to draft in, albeit maybe round 5 of a rookie draft, but
Sure.
just because the expected projected draft capital is so low. But he's someone who excites me. What did you see on tape?
Yeah, on tape, I agree with you. This was somebody that when you saw him get down the field, he was able to leaps and bounds get ahead of the defensive back, and we're talking about lower competition, but stacked the defensive backs really well, adjusted to the football really well, was able to go up and get it, and we're talking about a really bad quarterback. I mean, there were so many times where he was severely overthrown or severely underthrown. It was tough to watch at times because you see all this potential for all these big plays, and he would just constantly get bad throw after bad throw. But what impressed me was I even saw him. It wasn't just the stuff going deep, but a lot of stuff over the middle where he would adjust and catch footballs behind him, knowing that he was in traffic and was still able to take that on. He had a big enough frame where he wasn't afraid to take some of those hits. I know those hits are harder at the NFL level, but if you get him a quarterback that can at least get close to getting him a catchable pass on a semi-regular basis, I think there's a lot of big plays to be had. So when we're talking about somebody that's going to be more likely a stand-up Y, I mean, you could use him as an X, but I would really like to see him be more of a stand-up Y at the next level. I think he could dominate, these nickel corners at the NFL level. So I'm really excited about him as well.
Yeah, over 2,000 receiving yards over the last 3 seasons on 87 catches. Like you can factor in the low level of competition, but that's still pretty crazy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Is there anybody right now that is on your do not draft list? And obviously it comes relative to where we expect them to go. But is there anybody right now that you're like, I would be shocked if I had this guy on a single one of my dynasty teams this year?
That would be running back Isaiah Spiller. It's just I know people are
Okay.
talking about him as though he might be the best running back in the class, or early round 2 even. It's just my production model hated him, my athleticism model hated him. So it's just if you don't have those 2 things, not hate. I think it had him like RB6 or RB7, but that's like nowhere near in line with ADP. And then the pro day was abhorrent. So he's just not someone I'm ever going to draft at his price tag.
No, that makes sense. And we've kind of seen a little bit of a precipitous drop for him over the past 2, 3, 4 months. Whereas, in the beginning of draft season, we were talking about him and Breece Hall kind of this neck and neck. And for somebody, we've talked about this before that loves to watch tape, watches a ton of tape. I was really high on Isaiah Spiller on my surface level stuff. But once I really dug deep, I realized there was no comparison between him and Breece Hall. Breece Hall blew him away in just so many areas, but I think Breece's vision combined with his patience and then the ability to be able to read the gaps, read the holes, and then use his acceleration to get through just right at the opportune moment is just real special feel and timing for the running back position. So definitely a big fan of Breece Hall. And that's why the league we're in, I ended up snatching him at the beginning of the 3rd round, which felt maybe a hair early, but at the end of the day, it ended up being worth it for me. But Scott, any other players that just stick out to you positively, negatively, and it could be any position. It doesn't have to be the wide receiver position, quarterback, tight end, that just sticks out way above consensus or way below consensus that you're like, I just don't get what everybody else is seeing right now.
Someone I'm lower on?
Yeah, could be lower or higher, whichever, just one that really sticks out for you.
Some guys with day 3 projected draft capital that I like a lot more than consensus would be Justin Ross, Tyquan Thornton, and Wan'Dale Robinson. So let's talk film for a second, just because I have your film expertise to rely on here. Did you watch Jameson Williams 2020?
I watched a little bit, but not much. I focused mostly on his 2021 with Alabama.
Yeah, so that was a massive red flag for me. I love Jameson Williams. He's probably going to be no lower than my wide receiver 2, maybe my wide receiver 1. But a massive red flag for me was there was a narrative that he was buried on the depth chart behind Chris Olave, behind Garrett Wilson, and it just wasn't true. He had like 500 fewer receiving yards than Chris Olave, or probably even more than that, but only on 40 fewer routes. And so it was just he wasn't targeted. And I went back and I watched the film, and he was wide open on seemingly every single play. And it was just like, why does Justin Fields hate him? Because he's wide the F open and he's just never getting targets. He even saw double coverage, like more often than you would think, maybe more often than the other wide receivers. And this is a guy with 9 catches the entire season. So it was just super bizarre. But yeah, we can go back to some of the guys I'm higher than consensus on. Another one is Justin Ross. How much time did you spend watching his 2019 season, his 2018 season, his freshman and sophomore seasons? Because I think you really have to throw out 2021 because he broke a bone in his foot prior to the season starting. He barely practiced at all. It was bottom 5 quarterback play. And, he couldn't move properly. He couldn't run proper routes. He had like a really stiff orthotic in his shoe. And that's what one AFC executive said to Lance Zierlein. He put in his report as like, just throw out 2021. So if you're going off of those first 2 years of tape, what did you see? Because the numbers say, okay, his freshman season is the best ever season by yards per route run in PFF history by a landslide, ahead of Devonta Smith's 2020 season. And you have to factor in target competition, playing alongside T. Higgins, Amari Rodgers, Hunter Renfrow. He didn't start a single game. He had about like 50% fewer routes run than the wide receiver 3. And he led the team in receiving yards. He was a freak. And like on a per route basis, he was putting up the exact same numbers as T. Higgins, but he's not priced anything like T. Higgins. There's no like T. Higgins upside in his range of outcomes. Obviously, the medical red flag is a massive one. Maybe he can never go back to being who he was, or teams don't want to, draft this guy. They don't want him on their team because like the risks with that injury and the surgery are massive, really scary red flags. But just going off of his first 2 years of tape, what did you see?
No, you bring up a ton of great points, and I did. I spent a lot of time watching him in 18 and 19, and then I watched, most of the games that I could get my hands on for 2021 as well. So I watched a lot of Justin Ross, and I actually tweeted out at one point, I have no idea what to do with Justin Ross, because the player that you see as a freshman and as a sophomore versus the player in his final season, they're not the same guy. And, you mentioned the foot stuff. He also had to have the back surgery. DJ Ungalele was absolutely terrible this year for Clemson. Just off errant passes galore. So it was just a really, really odd situation. And it's not very often that you say, okay, go back to when this kid was 18 years old. And so that way you can get a good evaluation. So I think he is one of the biggest bust prospects in the class. Could there be a situation where he does get back to his old self? Absolutely. And we're talking about the stud freshman that people were talking about. Is he better than T. Higgins, who was a 2nd-round pick? Probably should have been a 1st-round pick by the Packers, but we won't go there. But was a 2nd-round pick in the NFL draft, and was looking like this all-world beater. And then you have this guy now that just couldn't seem to separate, seemed almost disinterested. Like, I don't want to say disinterested, but like disheartened at just how bad things were at Clemson and maybe his stuff with his foot. So it's just one of the more bizarre evaluations that I've had to make on a player over the past 5 years of me doing this.
Yeah. So just my general strategy is, the cost of burning a round 3, round 4 rookie pick is nothing compared to like the upside if that pick turns into a T. Higgins player. So my risk tolerance is always much higher than just about that of anyone else in the industry. So I always gravitate towards those massive boom bust players. The only thing I'll say is, yeah, maybe it's worth waiting until after the rookie draft and then acquiring him at a cheaper price, just because everyone's saying this player is going late day 3. Dane Brugler had him going in round 7 to the Jaguars, which, by the way, that would be like an awesome landing spot. We know how his chemistry with Trevor Lawrence. But yeah, so obviously that's what we're dealing with. But that's the profile I love. Yeah, give me those home run swings.
Absolutely, especially later on in the draft. Really, second round on. I love just gambling on upside. So I totally understand that there. Well, Scott, I appreciate your time so much coming in, joining us, talking about these receivers and a lot of other players as well. Anything that you want to pump, plug right before we hit this NFL draft?
No, if you're interested, check out my draft guide, which is just a series of articles. It's my pinned tweet, and you can follow me on Twitter at Scott Barrett DFB. And thank you, Garrett. This was fun.
Absolutely, man. I thoroughly enjoyed having you on. And for everybody watching, thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.